This is Bread and Burgers, two everyday burger fanatics in pursuit of that perfect burger.
Join Jon and Jonas as they explore all there is about this tasty treat and deconstruct everything from bun to bun.
We hope you enjoy this discussion about burgers and everything life.
Welcome back to Bread and Burgers. This is episode 7.
Wow,
Episode 7,
already.
Jonas.
7 already.
Yeah, the complete number. Episode 7, that means that, hey, we're actually been going at this for, 7 weeks now?
Something like that.
Yeah, more or less. Also, we started right before the quarantine, so, it's kind of counting the weeks that we've been, in stuck sheltering in place, which is a good thing, don't get me wrong. Last about 2 days ago, we heard, 2 days from the recording, I heard our governor Gavin Newsom was saying, hey, we're not there yet, but maybe in 2 weeks' time, we'll roll a plan maybe and to see how we can restart the economy and stuff like that. I don't know. What about on the East Coast, Jonas?
Well, officially, I think we're not supposed to kick off until May. So it's really hard to say. I think I hear a lot of noise from kind of both sides, like, oh, do we need to shelter in place longer, or should we, restart the economy, let people go back to work, that sort of thing. And it's a tough question. Like, I kind of get both sides of the argument.
Yeah, and ultimately it's really not just a policy thing, right? It's a biological thing. We're talking about viruses and contagious people, and so even like with a restart of the economy, things are going to be slightly different. Today I went to the post office, I went to a grocery store, and we see the little kind of barriers, the sneeze guards up, and it just kind of occurred to me that even if this virus subsides, I don't think those sneeze guards are going down. So ultimately, it's going to change some things, right?
Yeah, I think it's gonna be different for a lot of, especially bigger cities, I think, where people are a little more aware. I think maybe further out, some of the places will try to just kind of go back to how things were previously. But I definitely sense that, right? Like, it was really weird, like at the UPS store, I was going to return something on Amazon. I went in and, they had the sneeze guard, and they also had a line of tape about 2 feet away from the counter, and they ask you to stand behind that. And, they reach around if they have to give you something, and they just leave it on the counter for you to take. And it was very different way. I'm a big proponent of, say, like ATM banking, where I could just go in, do my thing, or like self-checkout. But seeing it kind of everywhere is a little kind of jarring in some sense.
Yeah, it's everywhere here in the Bay Area, we do have a lot of people, and in California alone, I always do this fact, right? In California, the population of California is more than the entire Canada, so there's a lot of people, and up and down the state, and so when things can go south, it can go south, pretty quickly.
Right.
And so, being in a metropolitan area, it is, like very different that we're aware of news from, both sides of, the East Coast and our West, kind of, towards the Far East as well. So we know how impactful things can be. And of course, I'm not saying that Massachusetts, where you are, is anything rural, but
sure.
It's just, we have a heightened sense of awareness, that kind of thing. But anyway, kind of jumping right in to just relatively close to what we need to talk about today, but this is bread and burgers, where we talk about burgers and everything life. So,
Yeah.
we got the life part down, kind of. But Jonas, how did you get into cooking?
I got into cooking when I was in high school, actually.
Hmm.
I always really liked, enjoyed eating meals. I like food. So,
Mm-hmm.
part of me thought, why not learn how to cook? My dad is the one who cooks a lot at home. But in high school, I think it was my sophomore year, 10th grade,
Mm-hmm.
I took an elective. We have a foods class. We have a sort of mini test kitchen in our high school, and we had a class that you could take that was
Oh,
just all about cooking. So I took that for a few semesters, and that's kind of really what kicked me off into it. How about you?
okay. Well, you know, semi long story, but my dad was sick actually when I was a lot younger. When I was like at like age 8, 9, and 10, and so my mom was taking care of him a lot, and so a lot of things in terms of like cooking, in terms of doing like the laundry myself, we had to kind of adapt and do that early. So my sister, cooked quite a bit. My grandmother cooked quite a bit, and just kind of in general because of seeing them, cook, throughout the day. When cooking lunch or dinner for me. That kind of got me just interested, or in general, it's just a life skill that I picked up early on.
Hmm.
And so from like making Jello, early on to making a fried egg when I was like 9 years old or something like that, it just kind of sparked my interest in cooking, and it didn't get like I mean, I didn't cook like a complete meal until I was in college, because I moved out, to UC Davis and started cooking for my roommates, and always wanted to spice it up. Uh, I remember like doing some kind of a shrimp, and I did like kind of a charred kind of grilled shrimp, and then
Hmm.
put a little piece of lettuce kind of in the bottom, because my mom used to say, you eat with your eyes first, right? Both like the flavor, the texture, the smell, the presentation needs to be you know good in order for a meal to be good. So it really started from there, and just because my wife and I we just love food. She's a food science major. Um, we just started, this love of cooking our own stuff. From everything from like we made like Vietnamese rolls yesterday to making burgers, grilling, yeah, everything.
Yeah, I think there's this really kind of deep-seated joy in seeing other people enjoy your food. I think for me, like 95% of the time, I'm gonna be pretty satisfied with what I cook,
Hmm.
but there's a lot of times where it's like it's not that impressive. Like, because I know what I like, and it doesn't matter what kind of mess I throw together. I kind of know what I like, and so it'll come out kind of to my palate. But
Mm-hmm.
there is a very deep sense of accomplishment or achievement that you get when you make something for someone else and they're like, oh, it's that person's like, this is really, really good.
Yeah, yeah. Although I have a friend who, no matter what you give him, he says it's great, which I get it, and other people say that too. Like, oh man, every time, like just seeing how you enjoy, food it makes, any cook kind of warm up and be
Hmm.
all
Hmm.
giddy inside. But at the same time, I'm like, I also want you to kind of give me some critique, or at least like figure out if this is like A or B.
Right.
This is better, that's better. Be a little more critical. That's just my nature. I like to experiment. I like to do things. So I get what you're saying. Yeah, people who enjoy your food, compliment your food, you'll find satisfaction in it.
Yeah, and I think you know, you can kind of tell when people genuinely like what you're making.
Hmm.
I remember in high school I was making one of the dishes that I learned kind of from start to finish,
Hmm.
all the way through. Uh, was this kind of chorizo pasta ragu. And after making it once for a friend of mine, she basically was like, "Do you have more?" And I'm like, I think I have some more sauce, but we're out of pasta." She's like, "That's okay. I just want to eat the
Whoa.
sauce." And I'm like, "Okay, yeah, I think I did something right here."
Yeah, and sometimes it's also about consistency and not just one time pizzazz or flair. I remember the in college where my wife is 2 years junior, and it's the first like Valentine's Day or something that we get to spend together, in college, and I made a flaming Alaska, right?
Wow.
Made the cake, put the ice cream on, of course, it's store-bought ice cream at the time, and made the meringue, and also figured out how to light the alcohol on fire, and made a show. But ultimately, I mean, it wasn't that presentable, and it was good. It tasted good, but at the same time, it's just that pizzazz that like she's like, cool, and kind of that was it. And so of course, like, like my heart just broke in a million pieces. I mean, I'm happily married to her now, but still, nonetheless, it is not, sometimes it's not just about the pizzazz. And with the Instagram culture now, you just kind of want to show off like just that completed product,
Yeah.
but it might not taste that good.
Yeah, I think that's really important, and you want it to be, like, I'm more interested in the flavor than necessarily the look. I got into this whole like Instagram food photography thing kind of late, and the only reason I did it previously was to say, well, I ate a burger. Here's what it looked like, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of stories. Like my brother used to, at his church, he did this turkey roasting competition. And so he and a group of guys did this turkey roasting. And he was really proud because they won the award for best looking turkey. But he said it was really dry. It didn't taste very good.
Yeah. So anyway, today I guess kind of going directly into our theme. We talked about how to make the burger. No, we didn't. We talked about like how we rate the burger, what a burger is, all these kind of philosophical things about burgers, and which like we have friends who said, how do you talk about a burger for 45, 50, 60 minutes, right? So we just wanted to kind of take a step back and do something a little more practical. Right, Jonas?
Yeah, I think this is something that I would have loved to have as a resource when I started off, when I first moved into my apartment or got my own apartment. And I was like, well, you there's all this stuff that you now have to figure out how to do, or um, from like what to get for your kitchen all the way to like how to use different things. And when you watch your parents do it at home, you kind of just take it for granted, like all the stuff that they have, the spice cabinets, to the pots and pans, to just how they do things.
Yeah, again, we're not like professional cooks by any means. It's just we are gonna have a following list of some just tips and tricks on cooking in general, something related to burgers. But it's just some thoughts that we have, from the years of cooking and kind of burgering, and just trying to pass it on to anyone, to you guys, listening and watching. And a lot of times when we look at like the Food Network, right, or even like Bon Appetit, is that right? From like the last episode, it like yeah, they have an enormous commercial kitchen, or Giada at home. There's like this like awesomely laid out kitchen, but again, it's so far removed from what we have as laymen, that it's hard to figure out, like, do everybody need like all clad like D5 pans, or like a industrial cooktop for a good burger? No, so yeah, this is just a simple layman's tips and tricks.
Yeah, these are just things that we picked up along the way that seem to work for us, and certainly some of these will overlap with those sort of TV show tips, right? Because they're pros, they know what they're doing, and sometimes that's the best way to do it. But at the same time, um, I think you don't need to go out and drop 2 months paycheck on getting your kitchen stuff put together. Uh,
Yeah.
there are a lot of little things that we may have picked up that may not work for you. I make a lot of burgers, so one tool that I have that maybe a lot of people don't consider buying, and I wouldn't recommend you buy unless you make as many burgers as I do, is a burger press.
Hmm. Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. I mean, yeah, but it's a good perspective to have, to see, how has that helped you, kind of better your craft of making a burger, right? Well, let's get started. Jonas and I talked about this list, but first and foremost, I think the most important, one on this list is talking about food safety, right? We talk about food. We love cooking for people. We love cooking for ourselves, but it doesn't do anything. It doesn't mean anything if what you eat or what you cook gets you sick, right? And a lot of food safety is not really just about the bacteria and all that stuff, but it's about how you prepare and your process, how you keep things organized. So that's the first point, food safety. For me, I'm a stickler for it because my wife works in the food industry. We understand the risk of having cross contamination. So first thing is don't mix knives or cutting boards. If you have a knife and a cutting board that you cooked or that you were cutting raw meat in, please don't use that cutting board and knife for cooked meats, because then you just have all the bacteria transfer from your raw cutting board and knife onto the thing that you just cooked and killed. So that's a big thing.
Yeah, and I think one tip that I want to give in this realm in regards to cross contamination is not necessarily that I need, like 4 cutting boards and different knives every time I cook, but one tip that I want to give in terms of how it helps with food safety is clean as you cook. This case, right, if you're done cutting the meat, wash it off wash off your board and your knife before you even start cooking. Because once you get the meat on the grill, or the pan, it's gonna go really fast, and you don't want to be fumbling around figuring out like, oh, where do I put this? Oh no, my board is dirty. How do I carve this? Like for me, I have a really small kitchen. I have a really tiny kitchen, very little counter space. And so it helps me to say like, okay, I am going to clean this off and then put this back on my counter, and now I can carve with it. Or I'll flip it over to the groove side and I can carve with it because I don't have I have to use the same chef's knife. I don't have this humongous knife set, and I have this one counter space for this one cutting board. And it'll save you a lot of hassle down the line later, where you don't feel like you are overwhelmed or inundated with dishes to clean from not only the meal itself, but also all of your prep work.
Yeah, and I think again, we're not for the people who are just starting or want to get started in cooking. That's you're not gonna have like 50 cutting boards or like 50 knives, as Jonas was saying. It's just being smart and preparing ahead of time. If you know that you need to cut vegetables, and then also prepare the meat, for anything, not just burgers, right? Anything like cutting a steak, carving later, then kind of like have a game plan, and we'll kind of talk about that in a little bit. But cut the vegetables first, rinse it off, cut the meats. And then after you're done, then you start your cooking process instead of kind of doing it, ad hoc. But one thing that I kind of stumbled on, they were talking about, a lot of articles would talk about this, where make sure you don't use a knife that you cut a chicken with or the board, and then you cut meat with, at the same time. And I'm like, but they're both raw, right? So you have a raw board and then you have a cooked board. That's fine. However, if you cook when you're cooking a steak or when you're cooking fish, the temperature that of that protein getting done and done is actually much lower than chicken. So any kind of bacteria or things that it was on the chicken actually doesn't get killed because your meats have not reached that internal temperature yet. So that's why you want to finish off one task and then do the other task.
Yeah.
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 So yeah, so food safety, and again, there are just a lot of them, there, right? There's a lot of things that you can read about, a lot of facts that can get you paranoid, and you don't want to cook. All we're saying is, be safe. Wash your hands before you start. Wash your hands after you handle, raw meat, and just continually, you just be more cautious than normal. Then most likely it'll be good.
Yeah, you can't wash your hands too much.
Yeah.
In essence. Yeah, and so in line with moving from kind of food safety, and John kind of mentioned this, our second tip is know your context. And what we mean by that is specifically, what's your plan like for this meal? Are you making something really fast for yourself? Are you doing, if we think about burgers, right? Am I just making a burger for myself for lunch, or am I doing like a burger party? Because that is going to affect your workflow and how you do it. Like if I'm making a burger party, like I'm not finishing every burger at once, right? Like I'm not grilling and then assembling burgers one by one. It's more efficient to do it just continuously, to do it in batches, as opposed to if I'm just making a burger for myself. Not only will I potentially change the cooktop I use, just you're trading off maybe a little bit of flavor for expediency, or but also just kind of how I approach it. Like there are a lot more things that can be a little more ad hoc versus I need to have a plan for this.
Yeah. So really know your context. Like, what are you trying to achieve? And it's analogous to this, but there's another tip kind of embedded here. I wrote down, mise en place. It's a French term to set in place. What that means is that you want to prepare your ingredients and what you cook, kind of all laid out, kind of in front of you, and also categorize close to what you're doing. Like for example, if you're gonna marinate your meat, then put all the sauces that you start marinating with kind of around your meats. If you have finishing stuff that after you cook, you want to add something to your dish, then put it to towards the end, or at least kind of grouping it together, so then you don't get all mixed up. I don't know if this happens to you, Jonas, but how many times, have you realized that you need to add some, like ingredient like garlic or onions or grate some cheese, while the food is already on the cooktop, and then you start like grating like crazy, or like you chopping like crazy, and lo and behold, your food was burnt and you're flustered. Have you ever had that?
Yeah, I think generally speaking, it's in the test kitchen there is, and on TV there is a reason why they have those little Pyrex glass bowls of all of the ingredients kind of set out beforehand, and it's for this very reason. It's just so you have exactly what you need when you need it. Now at home, I tend to be less finicky or less precise about this, but it is important to know what you need and when you need it. So if I'm cooking a dish that calls for chopped scallions as a finisher at the end, I don't want to be chopping my scallions as the dish is finishing.
Right.
And so at the very least, you have done the prep work before you actually start cooking. Another tip for this, I personally find very helpful, is in terms of like a lot of cutting work. depending on what you're doing in terms of like either garlic or your aromatics like garlic or onion, it works especially if you have kind of either these like Tupperware containers or even those kind of those plastic pint or quart kind of takeout containers
Mm-hmm.
to do all of that, like to do all of that prep work on a day in advance, sort of.
Mm.
So like if I know I'm gonna use a lot of like chopped onions, like I'll have a little quart container full of chopped onions that I can always just go to. It's like, oh, I need chopped onions. I'm just gonna go to that for what I need.
Right, and find a workflow or find a way to make it work for you guys, right? We're not saying that you need to have like, all these little containers, although I do have them at my house, but little containers, everywhere, kind of aligned along your countertops. But nonetheless, find all we're talking about is prepare. Figure out what you need to do, chop all your stuff together, and put all your condiments or put all your spices kind of in arm's reach, measuring spoons and all that, or even pre-measure it first, into a container together. To kind of simplify your workflow, because when things start going, it can go fast, right? Especially when you're cooking like proteins, meats, what have you.
Yeah, and as you cook more, you're gonna kind of figure out how your kitchen works in a sense, like where to put stuff. You
Yeah,
will
that's a good one.
put a lot of things that you usually use within kind of arm's reach, right? Like you have maybe a little counter dolly that will have your go-to things. Like for me, it would be something like salt, pepper, maybe some sugar, soy
Mm-hmm.
sauce, and cooking oil. Uh, some others, they might have other things as well. I know like my parents sometimes keep a little bit of like MSG next to the cooking oil just because they like
Ooh,
cooking with it a little bit.
the special three-letter word.
So, yeah, it's as you cook more, you will figure out what are the things that I use the most, and those will be, and you'll arrange, you begin to arrange your kitchen in a way where, hey, this is really easy to reach, and it's always going to be right there.
Right, right. And one final thing before we move on to the third tip, is that what Jonas was talking about, hey, having little Tupperware containers or little things. One thing that professional cooks from Asia usually do, is that they have a bowl, a large-ish kind of 8-inch bowl or something, and when you cook, when you prep your garlic, your onion, your shallots, stuff like that. You can actually place them, kind of in a circular pattern, alongside, like garlic here, onion here, shallots here, carrots here, all within that bowl. So then, as you cook, you just scoop out that part, dump it in, and so you can have one container. You don't have to have like 50 million containers, right? All along your cooktop or countertop, and wash everything at once.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, definitely. And again, yeah, it's also consider like yeah what you can prep in advance. Like, if you know that you're going to be using a lot of garlic, then you can mince it all at once and store all of that minced garlic, and then you can just go to that. We had a friend of the family who used a lot of garlic and ginger. She's from Malaysia when she
ah,
cooks, and so she'd put it in everything. And so she would spend a day making a mountain of minced garlic and ginger, and then put it
yeah.
all into a quart container, and then she'd start just going through that whenever she's cooking.
Yeah, yeah, and just to kind of know your style, right? And again, this kind of flows all together, right? And tip number three is having a plan. We talked about it a little bit. When you know your context, know what you're planning to do. If you're cooking a quick meal for yourself, for your family, or a burger party, regardless of how, even for cooking for yourself, you need to have a plan.
Yeah, and that comes with knowing what you're going to make, right? And this isn't to say that while you're cooking, you can't add some sort of improvisations like, oh, I think this would be really good with this. But you need to have a general idea of what you're trying to put together as a meal. So if it's a burger, what kind of burger are you going to make? What kind of veggies do you need to put on? Do the patties
Mm-hmm.
need to be prepped in a certain way? Do they need to be marinated, or do they need to be seasoned differently than you normally would? When you prep the veggies, do you just need to make sure you have lettuce, slice some tomatoes, or are you getting a little fancy? Do you need to saute some onions and mushrooms? You need to put in the time to do that. And you also want to be very aware of what you want your final product to be like. So, and that includes, how do I get my product or my dish from the pan to the plate? Because if I take too long, like I have my bun ready, and then I put my lettuce on, and then I put my patty on, or I put my patty on, then my lettuce on. Some people are sticklers about this. Either way, but then I'm like, oh shoot, I need to like slice my tomatoes or slice my onions, or go find pickles or something, right? Then it's possible that the residual heat from your burger is going to wilt your lettuce, and that is not a fun burger.
Yeah, and again, I think it's just knowing in advance, and even for those who are, who like to follow recipes, kind of, to the dot, then kind of read it just a little earlier, right? Understand the overall general steps before you start. Okay, so I need to do this, chop up the onions while I continue stirring. Oh wait, I forgot to stir. Now, just have an idea or general idea of what you want to do before you step into the kitchen, or at least before you start cooking, applying heat to things, again, because when things happen, it can happen fast.
Yeah.
And so this is kind of more general, not just for burgers, but especially when you're cooking multiple items or multiple proteins, right? For example, that chicken takes longer to cook, again, because for safety reasons, and in general for doneness, the internal temperature of a chicken or kind of any poultry needs to be higher than that of a steak or fish. Then you need to kind of plan ahead, right? You need to maybe start the chicken a little earlier, or you cook the steak first and let it rest, and while that happens, the time of the chicken is going to get done, so then you have both dishes ready at the same time. I see a lot of this in Thanksgiving, right? You don't plan ahead, and while the turkey is almost done, and then the potatoes are not done yet, right? That's kind of the thing. You need to know when you're cooking multiple items, like how long each thing might take.
Yeah, and this seems really weird to say it, but in the kitchen, things are faster and slower than you think. And what I mean by that is, there are some things that you feel like will take a while, and as soon as you start doing it, you before you know it, it's done, and you have to scramble. And there are other things where you just have to be patient and wait for it to finish. It's not going to be instantaneous. And just to tack on to John's previous point, for those of you that are recipe readers, or starting off or following a recipe, please note that recipes are generally written with the assumption that you're going to read the whole thing through before you actually start cooking.
Yeah, fair enough.
Kind of like instruction manuals. And I know for me, like when I do like IKEA furniture, I have a bad habit of not actually reading the entire instruction manual before I start assembling. And that creates a lot of pain points. And unfortunately for cooking, it's kind of hard if you miss a step to like, oh, I can take this apart and put it back together, kind of thing.
Yeah, and a very like simple point, but a very important point is that salt your water before your pasta, right? Because ultimately, if your pasta's done without the salt in the water, your pasta is going to be tasteless. And even if you add it at the end, it's not the same. It's not hasn't penetrated into the pasta itself. Or even if you already add the pasta in and then you add the salt in, again, same thing. It just doesn't penetrate well. So just in a recipe, they will tell you that, hey, salt the water, make it very salty before you do something, before you add the pasta, before you start searing the meat. There are reasons for this.
Yeah.
It's not just the sum of just the individual parts.
Yeah, it doesn't work like addition. Order matters. But yeah, and to your point for salting pasta, there is salting pasta water. There is actually an additional reason to it, which is a chemistry reason, is that salted water boils at a higher temperature and it will cook your pasta
Ooh.
faster.
Yeah.
So you get you raise the temperature, and once the water boils, then your pasta will cook faster. Otherwise, the however long it says on the box may not get you the consistency that you're looking for.
Yeah. And speaking of temperature control, or the temperature of the water, the next tip is heat control.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think heat control, part of what goes into this is going to be what you use to cook. So your cooking surface, right? Are you using not just like are you using a gas stove or an electric stove or induction, but specifically down to like what kind of pan or surface are you cooking on? Is it a nonstick? Is it cast iron? Is it stainless steel? And that's really important because each one will retain a different amount of heat, and that's really the most important part is heat retention.
Hmm.
And controlling the temperature will is what is going to ensure that you have the correct doneness inside and outside.
Yeah.
That it's got a nice char on the outside, but isn't overdone on the inside, or is not underdone on the inside, and and just kind of has and super charred on the outside.
Yeah, and talking about cooking utensils, here's my tip that if there's only one pan that you ever need, right? It's actually not a non-stick pan, but a cast iron pan. Of course, you can go to a thrift store and find like old pre-loved cast iron pans and all that, or you just go to your local like Target, Walmart, what have you, and get a Lodge cast iron pan. It's a great pan. You can do most everything in it. Yeah, I don't want to fry an egg on it, but for the most part, you can do like almost anything to it. And the reason why, for cast iron, because heat retention. It's heavy for a reason. The heat kind of like keeps it. I mean, the heat that it has, while it's on the cooktop, gets kind of trapped inside, that giant heavy pan. And as you continue to cook, you put more things on it. The pan doesn't lose as much heat, than others, right? I come from a family. My mom used to love cooking, still do love cooking with nonstick pans. Used to be Teflon, and now like whatever hex clad, stuff like that. But again, I just found that a $20 Lodge cast iron pan does wonders.
Yeah, I would normally be on the same boat as you, except recently I made a new discovery,
Ah,
which I have to credit to Alton Brown,
okay.
and that is carbon steel pans.
Yeah, yeah.
And I actually prefer the carbon steel over the cast iron, just
Mm-hmm.
because so for those of you that aren't sure, the best way that I would describe a carbon steel pan is it's kind of a happy marriage between cast iron and stainless steel,
Mm.
and it has a little bit of a non-stick property inherent to it, but you use and you care for it very similar to a cast iron, except it's just because it's a single sheet of metal
Mm-hmm.
that is pounded into the pan. It has that smooth finish, so you can do things like fry an egg on it.
Hmm.
And the other thing that I want to point out is because temperature control is so important, and oftentimes our stovetop temperature control is kind of finicky. It's not very precise,
Mm-hmm.
right? You can do tests if you really want to and say like my high is 500 degrees and my medium is 300, right? You could do that, but it's kind of
It's really
like,
experience.
yeah, so you kind of get to know it, but for those of you that especially if you start using either cast iron or or carbon steel. One tip that I also learned from Alton Brown is that you actually already have a pretty precise temperature device in your kitchen, and that's your oven. And so
Mm-hmm.
one recommendation he gives you is if you're trying to get something really, really hot and you know what temperature you want it to be at, then you use your stovetop as a temperature maintenance and you preheat your pan inside of your oven.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
so when it comes out, it's that the temperature that you want. And depending on what you're making, right? So if you watch on YouTube Alton Brown, and we'll link to that, I think, in the show notes. It's his egg episode. Um, he just, for some of his recipes, he just, pulls the pan straight out. And because it's so good at retaining heat, you just put it on a stovetop that's off and you just cook on that hot pan.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, and again, it's a lot of this has to be experience as well. And in one thing that is hard for the cook starting out is if the instructions on the recipe say about 15 minutes on medium heat, right? Then you turn it to medium. But the problem is your medium might not be my medium, right? Might not be their medium, and so you just have to spend some time to get to know, your utensils, your cookware, and also don't be afraid to fiddle with your temperature knob, whether electric, induction, or gas, to maintain, the temperature. Like
Right.
I wrote down here on my notes that brown, not burnt, right? So yeah, if let's say, for example, the recipe calls for charring the burger or charring something, or browning the butter on high heat or something like that, yeah, okay, take it, like that's your guide. But then if you see that for your specific setup, when you do that, it's starting to get like blackened, then maybe you have to tone it down. A lot of like professional cooks actually do, fiddle with their temperature control as they are cooking. And again, a lot of that comes with experience, but just don't be afraid to kind of dial, make adjustments as you go in that regard.
Yeah, and kind of on the similar note, when it says to do something on X heat for like a medium heat for 15 minutes, for example, or for a burger it would be like a medium high heat for 4 minutes. One of the things that I've been guilty of, but I also think a lot of maybe novice chefs have to be aware of, and this is part of what I meant by things are fast and things are slow, is you want to make sure that your cooktop is preheated, right? Like when it says 15 minutes on medium high, that means your cooktop. It's not, I'm going to put it on the pan and flip my burner on to medium high and wait 15 minutes. That, that time.
And then put your protein or burger like right there on a cold pan, right?
Right. And so the thing is, right, like, that's part of, I think, the preheating in your oven tip. But I think in general, just anything you're cooking with, like preheat, right? One of my favorite tools in making burgers is actually not what most burger connoisseurs would imagine, but that's a contact grill, aka a George Foreman grill. Now, the cheap ones, right? Like a lot of people, they just flip it, plug it in, flip it open, and throw the burger on. And unfortunately, what you're doing is you are gradually heating up the burger, and that's why you probably aren't going to get a lot of sear. If you decide to, spend a little more and get like a nicer one, the one that I like is called the George Foreman Evolve Grill Series, and the main reason I like it is because you have kind of very rudimentary temp control. Like you can set a temp on it, and you can turn it on and off. You don't have to unplug it. But the main important thing that you have to do is you want to wait for it to beep at you like your oven and say, like, I am ready to cook, right? Your cooktop, like your oven, needs to be ready. If you put, cookies into a 400 degree, into a cold oven that you just turned on to 400 degrees, right? It's going to take a lot longer to cook.
Yeah, and it's not going to be that great. Yeah. So specifically for burgers, again, we'll have an episode dedicated for tips and tricks for burgers, but specifically for burgers, about yay thick, about about an inch or so, maybe. Jonas, what is your recommendation?
I would say 3 to 4 minutes per side. And
Okay.
it depends again on your cooktop, and how many you're doing in the pan, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm doing it on, say, like, if I'm doing it on like a George Foreman, it's 4 minutes flat, right? Because both
Mm-hmm.
sides are cooking at the same time. I would say, yeah, like 3 to 4 minutes on the first side, and then I only do one flip, and so after the flip, I would probably do maybe 30 seconds less on the second side.
Uh-huh.
But I'm also comfortable, say, because now that I'm using a carbon steel, I'm actually, and I, if I push my, especially if I push my burgers a little thinner, like
Mm-hmm.
I'm actually comfortable completely turning off the heat and just letting the residual cook the second side.
Right, right. And kind of analogous to that, if you have a cast iron or a carbon steel pan, when you count down to your second 4 minutes, remove that from the heat, and not just from the burner, right? Because you have residual heat in your pan, therefore remove whatever you cooked in out of that pan and onto a plate or whatever, so that it doesn't continue cooking on the pan itself. So it's kind of like what Jonas was saying. He says, for his pan, he would turn off the heat and then, let it cook through, 4 minutes and then remove it. But again, either way, it's about 4 minutes on heated surface, per side, and then remove it
Yeah.
for the most
And
part.
yeah, and I think for our next tip, is something that if you're very uncertain, I think when you first start cooking with meat, you're very uncertain about, is this done, is this not done? And you want to be really sure, then invest in a thermometer. Know the
Yeah.
temps that you need to hit, right? And so this was very useful for me, especially when I first started making larger, like, roasts, making like tri-tip roast, right? I didn't know how long it was going to take, and every roast is sized a little differently, so you want to make sure that the inside is done. And
Yeah.
so you just get a thermometer.
Yeah, and instant read, anything, it can be. Of course, the more expensive ones can be, much better, much more accurate. But again, anything from like $5 is already good enough. And for me, I like to cook with a thermometer. Maybe not for my burgers, but for almost anything else, because the temperature of the meat, or the internal temperature, really essentially means, is it overcooked, right? For steaks, I usually focus on about 125 to 129 for medium rare, and I'll get to that. It's a little low than your average Google search. And for medium, 135 to 140. And having that kind of precision helps, to make sure that you're not overcooking your meat and
Right.
making it like all tough and nasty.
Yeah, I think this is especially useful for people who are kind of cooking, say, like beef for the first time, especially larger cuts of beef, and it's a very useful tool to have. I think, in my family we eat a lot of Chinese food, so like the beef we have is always thin sliced stir fry, and so it doesn't matter kind of how well done it gets. But I think a large part of my family kind of shying away from large roasts and stuff like that is in part because it's hard to do well without a thermometer, especially if you've never done it before.
Well, I totally understand. For Chinese food, you typically don't use a thermometer, invest in one. But if at any time you're dealing with a larger piece of poultry, chicken thighs or chicken breasts, or even a giant turkey, I would say having a thermometer is super, super important. Again, it goes back to the food safety issue that you don't want to have. You don't want to have your meat under or overcooked in those scenarios.
Yeah,
That is
and
not working. All right. So let's see. I think that's kind of the last part, and then you can respond to that.
Sure.
So we'll kind of pick it. So let's okay. So having a thermometer for
Yeah,
turkey.
we can use that as kind of the last part. I don't have a lot I would say in response to that. It's just kind of, do we want to do an outro somewhere though?
I think the last part is the keep cooking and practice makes perfect. I think it's important,
Yeah,
so we can
so
try that. Give me a second. Actually, I think we're only 5 minutes out anyway. So
yeah,
let me deal with. We'll retake that
okay.
part. You can keep it rolling if you want to.
Yeah, sure.
Uh, okay. Run. Okay. All right. So let's get back to that, and then again, it's going back into having a thermometer, and then we'll kind of wrap up with keep cooking. Practice makes perfect. Okay. So yeah. So I agree with you there, Jonas. That for Chinese food, for people who cook Chinese food, for in general, usually don't invest in a thermometer, again, because the way that typical kind of Chinese or Southeast Asian cooking is done, it's meant to have a quicker kind of cooking temp, quicker cooking time or temperature, thinly sliced meats. But I would say, for if you were cooking kind of any kind of poultry, a large piece of poultry like chicken thighs or chicken breasts, or even a large turkey, having a thermometer is very important. And part of that is because of the doneness. And the other part of that too is to go back to the food safety issue, that you don't want undercooked poultry, or pork, for example, served to your guests, right? So
Yep.
whenever you can, I'm not saying go crazy and poke everything, but whenever you can, having a temperature and understanding the temperature that meat cooks at, can be very helpful.
Yeah, and to kind of tail end that, we also want to recommend that you remember to let your meat rest, right? Like, it's not only the time that it's on the pan that your
Hmm.
meat is cooking. And I think for burgers, especially, and even for other things, like, I would say this is probably more the case with like fish than it is with any other protein. You have to understand that, like, as long as it's above the a certain temperature, it's going to keep cooking.
Hmm.
And so there's different philosophies on it. One philosophy I think I also got from Alton Brown is, he has this with eggs, but I think it's true for a lot of things, where it's, if it looks done in the pan, it will be overdone on the plate.
Yeah.
And what he's saying is just simply, it goes back to heat control, but it also is just this idea of, know kind of how that process works, know that there's still residual heat. And for steaks especially, I think steaks and roasts especially, this is very important, is that you want to let the meat rest.
Yeah, and there's a lot of science goes that's behind resting meats, especially like steaks or pork. One thing is it allows the juices to redistribute, right? Because as you're heating, as you're heating the meats, the juices kind of go out to outsides, and then as you cool, it kind of like saturates back into more uniformly within the meat itself. So then when you have a steak, that is freshly done, and you cut into it, it actually weeps, right? You see, sometimes not only is there like kind of bloody water, but just a giant mess on your plate, and that's indication that typically you didn't let the meat rest enough. But again, going back to the temperatures that we gave for steaks, beef, for me, I usually do 125 to 129 for medium rare. And why is that? Is because, when you let it rest, especially if you have like a tin foil kind of covering your cooked meat, it allows for that cooking to continue. The residual cooking will continue to bring it up to the temperature that you want. Typically if you go to Google or the USDA website, they would say that for medium rare you want 130 Fahrenheit to 135, and for medium you want about 135 to or 140 to 145. I would consider that overcooked, because once you get that out of the pan, then suddenly you'll keep cooking, and then suddenly when you cut into it, you'll get this, not the doneness that you want.
Yep.
Yeah, there's a lot of theories behind it, but I would say just take it off the pan just slightly early. That actually helps.
It'll be earlier than you think, right? And because you have to remember to let the beef rest, I think you can take it off earlier, because I personally think like the Google USDA doneness temperature is like, this is the temp it should be at before it goes into your mouth.
Yeah.
Which is not actually the time you stop cooking it.
Yeah, and there's actually a lot of theories behind, like, it's about safety and all that. And then again, I'm not discounting or not agreeing with what they're saying in terms of the studies, but again, just from experience alone, you can take it off just slightly early, and let it kind of come up to temperature that way, which kind of goes to our last point, our last tip for this video. And that really is, a lot of this is about experience. Now, I know for the novice and the kind of dabbling into cooking, someone dabbling into cooking, it seems like we just like threw a giant textbook at you, or there's a lot of information that was presented to you guys. But again, it's about learning and accumulating experience, getting that intuition of cooking, kind of getting it down.
Yeah, it's being aware of kind of what works for you. And this is stuff that's worked for us. And we're trying to not just present you with what works for us, but also things to just kind of be aware of. And once you're aware of them, maybe you'll find a different thing that works for you, that works better for you, and encourage you to do that. But you're never going to find that out if you never get into the kitchen.
And for me, I see too many people who cook, something once, and make it look kind of amazing, for the most part, and then take a photo of it and put it on Instagram, and then say, I made this, and then you move on to the next project. I'm not against that per se, but the whole Dalgona coffee thing, it is that when there's a fad going, or when you want to show this off to your friends about how well you made this piece, the problem with that is, if you just continue to do that and just cook something once, thought it was good, move on, you never actually get the experience of perfecting your craft, or figuring out where you went wrong, and kind of doing that again, right? So for something that is as simple as burgers, or at least as common as burgers, I would encourage everybody to just make more of it. Sometimes it's going to fail. Sometimes it's going to look awesome and you can post on Instagram. But don't just do it once and set checklist. I got a burger. Now let's move on to ribs, or let's move on to, like a panna cotta or something. You get what I mean.
Yeah, and I think for me, right, like it's kind of the same idea of like, when we did our top 5 burger places, it's like, these are places I want to go back to. And so to me, right, one kind of patented sign of success is when you make something and you're like, man, I can't wait to like make that again and eat it, or when someone
Yeah.
else says that, right? And I think the way, and that's to me, right, like part of why I love cooking so much, and to develop that mastery. And hopefully you find something, if it's maybe it's burgers, maybe it's something else that you're very comfortable, everyone's like, this was really good, I want to eat it again, and you're like, no problem, let me just get into the kitchen and I know exactly what I'm going to do, and take the time, and that takes time to get to that point of mastery.
Yeah, practice makes perfect. And ultimately, these are our tips. It's just something that we accumulated, but we want to hear from you. What do you think? How can you contribute to this? What other tips? Did we miss something? Leave your comments down below. Let us know. And also, don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the little bell icon next to the subscribe button. Yeah, Jonas.
Yeah, so this has been our first part of tips in the kitchen from Bread and Burgers. I think next episode we're going to look a little more in depth on maybe how to make a burger, and what goes into that, and maybe some tips there. So hope you guys tune in, but until then,
See you next time.
see ya.